The first morning came as a whisper across encrypted channels, then exploded into a roar that would redefine Arctic airspace forever. 15 Russian Su-30 flankers, their twin engines screaming defiance into the frozen dawn, were racing westward in a formation that military analysts would later describe as either brilliantly orchestrated or catastrophically reckless. What followed in the next 37 minutes would become the most intense aerial engagement between superpowers since the Cold War ended, a dance of fire and steel at 40,000 feet, where split-second decisions carried the weight of nuclear nations and the lives of dozens hung in balance over water cold enough to kill in minutes. Commander Sarah Chen stood in the Carrier Intelligence Center, watching her displays transform from routine morning patterns into something that made her 15 years of naval aviation experience feel suddenly inadequate. The USS Theodore Roosevelt, positioned 70 miles north of Norway's jagged coastline, had been conducting standard freedom of navigation operations, the kind of presence mission that typically involved more paperwork than actual contact. Moscow had issued the usual diplomatic protests through back channels, calling the American carrier group provocative, threatening unspecified responses. Those threats had seemed hollow until 15 advanced multi-role fighters launched simultaneously from Severomorsk and turned their noses toward international waters with evident hostile intent. Chen's tactical display showed the Russian formation climbing aggressively through 35,000 feet, organized into 3 distinct packages that suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous response. 5 aircraft formed the lead element, pushing ahead at maximum sustainable speed. Behind them, 2 more groups of 5 maintained perfect spacing, creating a layered formation that could exploit multiple attack vectors simultaneously. Supporting them at distance, a lone electronic warfare platform orbited just inside Russian airspace, its powerful jammers already beginning to probe American defensive systems, testing for weaknesses and degrading communications before the fighters even arrived. The composition told Chen everything she needed to know. This wasn't reconnaissance. This wasn't posturing. Russia was sending a message written in aviation fuel and missile rails, and that message was coming fast. She reached for the secure line connecting her to Captain Michael Torres, the Air Wing commander currently somewhere in the bowels of the carrier reviewing flight schedules that had just become completely irrelevant. When Torres answered, Chen didn't waste words. "Sir, we have 15 Su-30s inbound. 3 packages, full combat loading suggested by their flight profiles. They're organized for penetration and they're not slowing down." The pause on the other end lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but Chen could hear years of training and doctrine collapsing into immediate tactical necessity. "Get Raptor flight airborne now. Full weapons load. Tell them this is real." Lieutenant Jake Morrison was reviewing his pre-flight checklist when the ready room speakers crackled to life with the operations officer's voice, clipped and urgent. "Raptor, Viper, Cobra, Talon. Immediate launch. Combat load. This is not a drill." The words sent Morrison and 3 other pilots exploding from their chairs with synchronized urgency, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. Flight suits were grabbed, helmets secured, harnesses clipped in movements that have been practiced 10,000 times, but never before executed with the knowledge that enemy fighters were actually inbound, that the training was suddenly terrifyingly real. Morrison's F-35C Lightning II sat on the bow catapult, its angular stealth geometry looking almost organic in the gray Arctic light. Weapons crews had already loaded the internal bays with 4 AIM-120D AMRAAMs and 2 AIM-9X Sidewinders, a loadout designed specifically for air superiority against peer adversaries. As Morrison climbed into his cockpit and began the startup sequence, Captain Torres appeared at his aircraft, shouting over the shriek of auxiliary power units and the perpetual wind that scoured the flight deck. "Russian package inbound. 15 flankers with electronic warfare support. They're testing us, seeing if we'll hold position or back down. Rules of engagement are weapons tight unless they demonstrate hostile intent. But Commander, if they light you up with targeting radar in attack mode, that's your green light. You have full authority to defend your flight." Morrison nodded, his throat suddenly dry despite years of preparation for exactly this scenario. Command meant making decisions while politicians argued, meant protecting his pilots, while hoping the people in Washington knew what chain of events they might be starting. He settled into his ejection seat, brought the Pratt & Whitney engine to full power, and gave the catapult officer the salute that acknowledged readiness for launch. 4.2 seconds later, 40,000 pounds of American aerospace technology were accelerating from 0 to 150 knots, and Morrison was airborne. climbing into an Arctic dawn that suddenly felt considerably less peaceful than it had 20 minutes ago. The 4 F-35s formed up quickly, Morrison leading with Lieutenant Emma Rodriguez on his wing, callsign Viper, known for her precise weapons employment and ice-cold nerves under pressure. Behind them, Lieutenant Commander David Park, callsign Cobra, and Lieutenant Amy Chen, callsign Talon, took positions in a combat spread formation that maximized sensor coverage while maintaining mutual support. They climbed through 40,000 feet with throttles at maximum continuous power, watching their tactical displays populate with increasingly detailed information about the inbound Russian fighters. The Su-30s were now 60 miles out and closing at nearly 600 knots, their powerful radar systems actively scanning, painting the sky with electronic emissions that the F-35's sophisticated passive sensors detected and cataloged. Morrison didn't know exactly where the American fighters were yet, and Morrison intended to keep it that way as long as possible. At 50 miles, the Russian formation began to evolve. The lead package split into two elements, one climbing to 45,000 feet while the other descended to 30,000 feet, creating a vertical split that would force the American fighters to divide their attention between high and low threats. The second package adjusted course northward, establishing a pincer movement designed to trap Morrison's flight between converging groups. Classic Soviet doctrine adapted for modern aircraft, the kind of tactics that had been refined over decades of Cold War competition and updated for stealth-era combat. Morrison's radio discipline kept the circuit quiet, but he knew his pilots were seeing the same tactical picture, understanding the same implications. They were 4 aircraft against 15, operating with better sensors and stealth characteristics, but facing numerical odds that would become overwhelming if the Russians pressed their advantage aggressively. The key was maintaining information superiority, using the F-35's ability to see first and shoot first to offset the numbers disadvantage. But that advantage evaporated if the Russians got inside the AIM-120's engagement envelope before Morrison decided to go weapons hot. At 40 miles, everything changed. 3 Su-30s from the high package suddenly accelerated, their afterburners igniting in brilliant plumes visible even at distance. They were coming fast, supersonic, closing the gap with obvious aggressive intent. Morrison's radar warning receiver remained silent, the Russians flying on passive sensors, but the infrared search and track system painted their heat signatures clearly. 35 miles, 30 miles, 25 miles, they weren't turning away. Then, at 22 miles, all 3 Su-30s activated their targeting radars simultaneously. The N011M BARS radar system wasn't as sophisticated as the F-35's APG-81, but it was powerful and these pilots knew how to use it. Morrison's warning receiver went from silence to screaming alert, as multiple fire control radars locked onto his aircraft and held. Not scanning, not searching, locked. The unmistakable signature of a weapons employment sequence.
"Spiked," Morrison called. "Multiple bandits have me locked. Attack mode radar, range 22 miles. His hand was already moving toward the weapons panel, but training held him back for 3 more seconds, giving the Russians a chance to break lock and turn away, giving diplomacy one last opportunity before missiles started flying. The locks held. Viper's voice came across the circuit, tight with controlled tension. "Raptor, I'm spiked too. They're setting up firing solutions on all of us." Morrison keyed the carrier frequency. "Roosevelt, Raptor flight is locked by multiple bandits in attack mode, requesting confirmation on rules of engagement." The response was immediate, Captain Torres's voice carrying absolute authority. "Raptor, weapons free. Repeat, weapons free. Engage and defend your flight." Morrison's training took over, years of tactical instruction compressing into fluid action. "Raptor engaged, Fox 3. The internal weapons bay door snapped open for precisely 2 seconds, long enough for the AIM-120D to drop free and ignite its motor, accelerating to Mach 4 in a brilliant exhaust plume before the bay doors closed again, preserving his stealth profile. Around him, his 3 wingmen were launching simultaneously, 4 American missiles streaking toward 4 Russian fighters across 20 miles of frozen sky. But the Russians were shooting too. Morrison's warning receiver registered missile launches almost immediately, multiple R-77 medium-range missiles leaving their rails from the Su-30 formation. The tactical display showed 8, then 10, then 12 inbound weapons, more than enough to saturate the American flight's defensive capabilities if they all guided properly. The merge was 40 seconds away, and Morrison knew with absolute clarity that some of those missiles were going to find targets unless his pilots executed their defensive procedures perfectly. The first AIM-120D reached its target at 18 miles, the Su-30 exploding in a fireball that briefly turned the Arctic dawn orange. Splash 1, Viper confirmed, her voice professionally calm despite the fact that she just killed another human being for the first time in her career. But there was no time to process that reality, because the Russian missiles were still coming. And now they were inside 15 miles, their active radar seekers going autonomous, hunting for targets. Morrison broke hard left, deploying chaff and pulling 7 Gs in a turn that compressed his vision and made his flight suit's G-tolerance system squeeze his legs to keep blood in his brain. The nearest R-77 followed his turn, its seeker tracking through the chaff cloud, adjusting course to intercept. At the last possible second, Morrison reversed right and deployed flares, cutting his throttle to minimize his infrared signature. The missile's dual-mode seeker, confused by contradictory inputs from its radar and infrared sensors, chose poorly. The warhead detonated 60 feet behind Morrison's aircraft, close enough to rattle the jet with overpressure, but far enough that shrapnel missed the critical systems. Viper wasn't as lucky. Her defensive break came a fraction of a second too late, and an R-77 detonated 30 feet from her aircraft. The F-35 shuddered violently as shrapnel tore through the tail section, puncturing hydraulic lines and damaging flight control surfaces. "I'm hit," she transmitted, her voice strained. "Significant tail damage, losing hydraulic pressure on the left side, still flying but degraded." Morrison checked his tactical display even as he continued defensive maneuvering. 2 Russian fighters were down, but 13 remained airborne and were now fully committed to the engagement, closing distance rapidly for a visual range merge where their superior numbers and the Su-30's legendary agility would become decisive advantages. The electronic warfare aircraft, orbiting safely behind the Russian fighters, suddenly increased its jamming power dramatically. Morrison's displays flickered and degraded as powerful interference overwhelmed his data link connection to the carrier and his wingmen. Information that had been flowing smoothly across the screens suddenly stuttered and fragmented, forcing him to rely more heavily on his organic sensors. The carefully networked system that made the F-35 so lethal was being systematically degraded by Russian electronic attack. "All Raptor elements, data link is degrading," Morrison transmitted on tactical frequency. "Switch to organic sensors and call out your targets manually." The formation automatically adjusted, spacing increasing to account for reduced situational awareness. They were now fighting blind compared to their normal capabilities, and the Russians knew it. At 12 miles, Morrison made a decision that he knew would generate questions later, but felt absolutely necessary in the moment. "Raptor, engage on the jammer," he called, designating the electronic warfare aircraft as his target. Viper's voice came back immediately. "Raptor, that's not a fighter, that's a support bird." His response was clipped. "That support bird is killing us. It dies now." He selected his last AIM-RAM, established a firing solution on the IL-22 electronic warfare platform orbiting 30 miles northeast, and launched. The missile covered the distance in 45 seconds, while the IL-22 crew, trained to support combat operations but not expecting to become targets themselves, took no evasive action. The 4-engine aircraft disintegrated in a massive fireball that ended the jamming instantly. Morrison's displays immediately cleared, data link flooding back online with full fidelity. The tactical picture that had been fragmented and uncertain suddenly became crystal clear again. He could see his wingmen's exact positions, their weapon status, their aircraft health. More importantly, he could see all 13 remaining Russian fighters with perfect clarity, their formations, their headings, their vulnerabilities. "Roosevelt, Raptor, link is back up. Request immediate reinforcements." Taurus's response carried obvious relief. "Raptor, 8 additional Lightnings launching now. ETA 7 minutes. 7 minutes felt like an eternity when 13 enemy fighters were converging on your position. But Morrison had to keep his flight alive until the reinforcements arrived. The Su-30s were now inside 10 miles, close enough for visual identification, and Morrison could see the distinctive twin-tail configuration and wide-set engines that gave the flanker its predatory appearance. 3 Russian fighters were diving toward Cobra's damaged aircraft, obviously targeting the wounded bird. Morrison reversed hard, trying to get angles for a shot, but the geometry was wrong and he was out of long-range missiles. Cobra saw them coming too. Instead of running, which would have been futile given his damaged condition, he pulled vertical in a desperate energy bleed, forcing his pursuers to follow or break off. 2 Su-30s followed him up, afterburners blazing, all 3 aircraft climbing past 50,000 feet, where the air was thin and engines struggled. At the apex, where both forces were nearly stationary and barely flying, Cobra rolled inverted and pulled through in a hammerhead reversal that brought him down on top of the lead Su-30. He selected guns, the only weapons he had left, and fired a controlled burst from the GAU-22 cannon. Depleted uranium rounds walked up the Russian fighter's spine, shredding control surfaces and piercing fuel tanks. The Su-30 rolled uncontrollably and began to fall, trailing fire. Cobra's transmission was matter of fact. Splash 3, that's guns. But the victory was costly. Cobra's aircraft, already damaged and now pushed through extreme maneuvers at the edge of its flight envelope, was barely controllable. "Raptor, I'm done," Cobra transmitted. "Hydraulics are failing. I need to get feet wet and head home." Morrison wanted to order him out immediately, but the tactical situation was still critical, and every aircraft mattered. "Can you stay in the fight?" There was a pause. Then Cobra's response carried the weight of a professional making a calculation between mission requirements and survival instinct. "Affirmative, but I'm Winchester on missiles and my guns are almost dry."
The next 5 minutes compressed into a blur of maneuvering and missile launches. Talon, flying with methodical precision, systematically engaged Russian fighters at maximum range, using the F-35's superior sensors to establish firing solutions before the Su-30s even knew they were being tracked. She splashed 2 more flankers with textbook AMRAAM shots, her calm voice on the radio providing a stable anchor as the tactical situation swirled into chaos. Viper, despite her damaged aircraft, managed to maneuver into position for a close-range Sidewinder shot that destroyed another Su-30 at just 3 miles range, the heat-seeking missile tracking perfectly into the Russian fighter's exhaust plume. Then the reinforcements arrived. 8 more F-35Cs streamed into the engagement zone from the south, their weapons bays full and their pilots fresh. Their appearance broke whatever commitment the remaining Russian pilots had to continuing the fight. 7 Su-30s that were still airborne executed simultaneous hard turns and headed northeast at maximum speed, running for the safety of Russian air defense coverage. Morrison checked his fuel state, saw he was down to 12%, barely enough to make the carrier. "Roosevelt, Raptor, bandits are retreating. Request permission to pursue." Torres's response was immediate and non-negotiable. "Negative, Raptor. Return to base immediately. We've made our point. Don't extend into their SAM envelope." The 4 F-35s turned south toward the carrier, their formation ragged, their aircraft damaged and fuel critical, but alive. Behind them, the Arctic Sea was marked by smoke columns and debris fields where 8 Russian fighters had gone down. The engagement had lasted 37 minutes, from first launch to final retreat. And in that span, the rules of great power competition had been rewritten in fire and wreckage. Morrison trapped aboard the Theodore Roosevelt with his fuel gauge showing 8% remaining, so close to emergency reserves that the landing signals officer had been preparing to wave him off to a tanker if the approach hadn't been perfect. As plane captains chalked his aircraft and began post-flight inspections, Morrison sat in his cockpit for a long moment, hands still gripping the stick and throttle, adrenaline slowly draining away to be replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion and the beginning awareness of what had just happened. The debrief lasted 4 hours. Captain Torres walked them through every phase of the engagement, with representatives from intelligence, legal, and command staffs listening via secure satellite link. 8 Su-30s destroyed with no American aircraft losses, though 2 F-35s would require extensive repair. Morrison's decision to engage the electronic warfare platform generated the most discussion, with lawyers questioning whether a support aircraft constituted a legitimate target under the rules of engagement. Morrison's answer was direct. It was degrading our ability to defend ourselves. That made it a threat. I'd make the same call again. Torres ended the debrief with information that put the tactical victory into strategic context. Moscow is calling this unprovoked American aggression. They're demanding an emergency UN Security Council session. Washington is backing our actions completely, calling it legitimate self-defense in international waters. The political fallout will be significant, but understand this: you responded exactly as your training and rules of engagement required. The decisions were sound, the execution was outstanding, and you brought everyone home. The rest is above our pay grade. That night, Morrison stood on the flight deck watching maintenance crews work under floodlights, repairing Viper's damaged tail section and replacing Cobra's destroyed hydraulic systems. The Arctic sky was clear, stars brilliant against the black dome overhead, and somewhere to the east, Russian crews were conducting their own maintenance and debriefs, counting their dead and recalculating what American presence in the Arctic actually meant. Morrison thought about the 8 pilots who hadn't survived the engagement, professionals like himself who'd launched that morning thinking they were executing a routine pressure mission and instead found themselves in combat they couldn't win. He thought about their families receiving notifications, about the political officers in Moscow already spinning the battle as Western aggression, about the analysts in Washington arguing whether the rules of engagement needed revision. Most of all, he thought about the fact that tomorrow he'd be back in the cockpit, flying the same patrol over the same waters where today's battle had been fought. Because the mission continued, the Arctic remained contested, and the only certainty was that there would always be another crisis, another provocation, another morning when someone would have to decide whether to pull the trigger or back down. This time they'd pulled the trigger. 8 Russians had died. The Americans had won. And now everyone would live with the consequences of 37 minutes that had changed everything.